One evening in the summer of 1985, there was a torchlit march on the streets of San Francisco in memory of the many people who died of AIDS. But its impact was as nothing alongside an announcement from Paris.
Mr. Rock Hudson has acquired immune deficiency syndrome. He came to Paris to consult with a specialist in this disease.
I was surprised and shocked. It was like, damn, this has gone big time. This is not just sneaking around in the back alleys and back rooms. This got to Rock Hudson. But I was also shocked that he couldn't get it taken care of. Somehow in the back of my mind, I kept thinking if you really had enough money, you could really get this thing dealt with.
Hudson became ill.
The news brought AIDS out of the closet. If Hudson had it, was anyone beyond its reach?
And when he came back from Paris by private plane on a stretcher to die, it was probably the beginning of the crumbling of my denial, that this could also happen to me.
And I remember being astounded that it took Rock Hudson to galvanize America's attention. I had never crossed my mind something seemingly so trivial as a movie star's tragedy or something would capture the national attention. I guess in this cult of fame and wealth, it took a movie star getting sick to get America to take it seriously.
Into the epidemic, more than 8,000 Americans had already died. A further 15,000 were known to be infected with HIV. But this latest death changed the mood. Rock Hudson was an all-American symbol, and when he died, all Americans, it seemed, wanted someone to blame.
That it is fully within our knowledge and capabilities to teach them how to protect themselves. And
gay leaders like Roger McFarlane found themselves in the firing line.
And I think it's very important for our audience to think about here in the studio that sometimes you have to go to retarded people who are homosexual or otherwise or sexually involved, and you have to talk to them. Needle users, especially the ones who go to shooting galleries who trade the needles with each other. These are the type of people, it seems to me, should be quarantined. They're dangerous. They're dangerous to the rest of the people.
It's almost comical now. I remember, you know, like the back row of the audience shouting faggot, 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 like it was a football game or something. And Morton Downey was a notorious pig and a deliberate sensational provocateur, and that was his bread and butter. I mean, that's what he trafficked in. But I remember thinking, boy, this is really where America is. This man really has his finger on the pulse. These people really hate us.
Political bullcrap. We'll be back in just a minute.
Prejudice fed on ignorance. No one really knew how you caught AIDS, and everyone feared the worst. The Ray family in Florida soon fell victim to this hysteria. They had 3 boys, Ricky, Randy, and Robert, who suffered from hemophilia, a hereditary disease which meant their blood didn't clot. To control their condition, they had to have injections of factor VIII, made from other people's blood. The boys, one of whom has now died, were infected through their medicine. When the family first found out, they turned to the local minister for advice.
I took the minister into confidence and explained to him what was going on, and he seemed to be okay with it. But a couple of weeks later, he came and told me that he was getting phone calls from, other parishioners who were, afraid and were threatening to sue him. And, he said, I think it's really best if you don't, you just don't come back to church. So we didn't.
I am deathly afraid of AIDS disease. Anybody that says they're not afraid of AIDS is a fool or a liar.
They didn't know nothing about it. It's a little redneck town.
If we were in school, we'd have recess. Kids, whenever I got on the swings, they would move away, or whenever I got on the merry-go-round, they would all get off,
The boys and their family were ostracized by the community, but worse was to follow.
The sheriff called and told Mom and Dad that they were having a rally and that we should leave town for the night.
I had a feeling something was going to happen that night. So then I just went to sleep. Then the next morning, I woke up. My dad told us our house burnt down. I had a stuffed animal named Mr. Monkey. I said, what about Mr. Monkey's? He's gone too. I started crying.
You know, we knew that these people were very afraid, that they didn't understand about AIDS. Ignorance can cause fear, and fear causes violence.
1,000 miles north in Brooklyn, New York, young Joey DePaolo discovered he'd been infected with the virus through a blood transfusion. His doctors advised the family not to tell anybody. Everyone knew what had happened to the Rays.
The Rays, they got that house burned down, so I didn't want to be like them and get my house burned down, so we didn't want to tell anybody. And I just kept it a secret, and it hurt, because I don't like keeping secrets.
And the doctors had told us not to tell anyone. They had said if we were to tell anybody, that they wouldn't understand that AIDS was not an acceptable disease. There was a stigma on it.
Before long, though, Joey's secret leaked out. Parents of other kids at his school told the headmaster they wanted Joey to leave.
Why should my son have to live his life in fear and isolation? He's a person with a sickness, and he deserved the same respect as any other disease.
There was like 2 families that showed up with 2 signs like, we don't want Joey in school, but I felt that they were ignorant, that they didn't want to learn anything. Then all the parents that were there was a few parents, and they were like, oh, well, Joey lives around the block from us, and Joey lives here, Joey lives there, and we're not afraid of him. We let our kids stay there, so I think that helped a lot.
I wanted to go back to a time when life was so safe, and I didn't have to deal with something like AIDS in my home. You know, because mothers are supposed to be able to kiss the boo-boo and let it go away, you know, and I couldn't make this go away. The government wasn't doing anything across the board. We came through 2 administrations that did not even want to know about AIDS at all, or the people that were dying from it, or the suffering that was going on with it. They didn't want to know from Adam about AIDS.
No government anywhere wanted to know much about AIDS in those days. Britain was typical of many Western countries where AIDS had surfaced. Among legislators and the public at large, sympathy was in short supply. Reaction to gay activists often hovered between indifference and disgust.
I make no bones about it. I don't like homosexual practices at all. I think it's a God-forsaken, unnatural, unhealthy, disease-ridden occupation, and that it is anti-family life, and that really we should be minimizing it anyway. The AIDS virus has given us yet one more reason for wanting to minimize the amount of homosexuality in society.
One of the most active campaigners was Tony Whitehead.
Such was the nature of anti-gay prejudice that if we didn't do something about this, nobody else would. That, you know, we would be allowed to drop like flies, and it was as though there was a war going on that nobody else recognized except those who were actually being shot at.
Early on, Whitehead had helped set up the Terence Higgins Trust, a support group named after one of the first people to die of AIDS in Britain. By now, 250 others had died, and he wanted the government to take action.
The Conservative government then, as now, was making great political capital out of the whole concept of family values, and that is, by definition, quite homophobic. And they were quite, people like Norman Fowler were quite honest about the political difficulties they faced in getting effective AIDS education campaigns through their government colleagues.
I mean, it was just like the public, as far as government was concerned and government ministers were concerned. Some people felt very uncomfortable with the whole subject.
Norman Fowler was then health minister in the cabinet run by Margaret Thatcher. She had left her team in little doubt of what she thought about homosexuality.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
I think it's very difficult to really know what went on behind the scenes and what Mrs. Thatcher's influence was, but I think the inklings one has does give one a feeling that she was very uncomfortable about AIDS, very uncomfortable about anything that had to do with sexually transmitted diseases, and wished to ignore the problem.
Michael Ardler had been dealing with AIDS cases since they first appeared in Britain. In alliance with Fowler's own health officials, he bombarded the minister with information about how the epidemic was developing. Late in 1986, it began to have some effect.
So there was one's own personal reaction to it, and there was all the medical advice as well. I mean, you really did feel that time was running out, that unless you acted, the position was going to get dramatically worse. And what dramatically worse meant was that people were going to die.
A key figure behind the scenes was Donald Acheson, the government's top health advisor. He realized that nothing would happen unless Mrs. Thatcher was persuaded.
I think she did find this subject difficult, and I think being the very forceful personality that she is and forthright, positive leader in that cabinet, it influenced her colleagues.
I remember taking Donald Acheson to see her. I remember the explanation of the issues to her. I remember her understanding of that. But basically, she was wise enough to stand to one side, to set up the Cabinet Committee, and to allow us to continue in that way.
The Health Secretary, Norman Fowler, has announced a new campaign to bring home to everyone in the country the dangers of AIDS.
This is a mock-up of the front cover, and as I say, that will be going out to every household in the country.
So behind closed doors, an incongruous group of ministers, officials and doctors began to debate just what sort of sexual detail they could thrust into the viewer's home.
At that time, health ministers found it extremely difficult to deal with these highly intimate matters on television and radio, and they asked me to do it. I have the distinction, if you may call it that, of being the first person to talk about anal sex on television in the world, I think.
There is now a danger that has become a threat to us all. It is a deadly disease and there is no known cure. The virus can be passed during sexual intercourse with an infected person. Anyone can get it, man or woman.
Most countries in the industrialized world went through the same sort of process. Anal sex was unblushingly discussed in polite circles. Condom, in various languages, became an everyday word.
If you ignore AIDS, it could be the death of you. So don't die of ignorance.
Scare tactics or persuasion, each country took its own line.
Dachte jeder, die USA sind weit und was geht das mich an?
But if not stopped, it could kill more Australians than World War II.
Il paraît que ça coupe tout.
Only America ducked the message the others were grappling with.
How do you get AIDS?
I don't know.
If you must sleep with more than one partner, you must wear a condom. Because if you do get AIDS, what can the doctors do to save you?
I don't know.
When my British colleagues were able to get a national AIDS policy going, I tried to use that as a source of embarrassment to our own government and say, if they can do it, why can't we? And in the industrialized nation, we're going to look as though we're a little bit reticent on the one hand or incapable on the other.
Scientific evidence indicates
Surgeon General Everett Koop was the top health official in the Reagan administration. In this crucial period, he found himself up against the same sort of moral conservatism that had delayed education programs in Britain.
HIV infection known at this time for...
I think there was resistance on the part of the Reagan administration at the top and halfway down and at the bottom, because it was a distasteful subject to them that they didn't really know how to handle.
We're talking about death here.
In late '86, Just as the British campaign was starting, Coop released a report on AIDS. It got little effective backing from the administration. The President, in his first public utterance on the subject, was lukewarm in support for government action.
Now, how that information is used must be up to schools and parents, not government. But let's be honest with ourselves. AIDS information cannot be what some call value neutral. After all, when it comes to preventing AIDS, don't medicine and morality teach the same lessons?
Some people have said it was a homophobic administration. I think that's a bad word. Homophobic has the connotation of being fearful of. This wasn't fear, this was hatred.
In this atmosphere, Jerry Rosenbaum, the gay stockbroker who'd been so shocked by Rock Hudson's death, now had to cope with a death much closer to him.
Jim and I he was my great love. I loved him more than life itself. But when he got sick at the end of '86, my world came apart. The night before, I sort of anticipated something was going to happen. And the next morning, I got a call from Jim Wernson, he's dead. And I didn't know what to do. I mean, I don't know what I hadn't planned on this. So I went down, and I couldn't believe he was dead. I mean, it was like, I couldn't believe it. His dad and mom come, and it was ugly. The priest at NYU would not go into the room of any AIDS person, and he wouldn't go into Jim's room and give the last rites. But his dad, as we were going into the room, put his fist in my chest and forced me out of the room and closed the door. So I thought, well, you know what you got to do? You got to go on with your life. You know, there's no way to prepare men for this. How am I going to say, my wife died, my husband died, the most important person in my life died? And I acted as if nothing had happened, because there was nobody there I could share that with.
The message to people with AIDS was clear. It was no good waiting for the politicians. If they wanted action, they would have to get into politics themselves. And that, amid their sorrow and their fear, was just what they were about to do.
If your heart always did what a normal heart should do, if you always play a part instead of being who you are, and you might just miss the one who's standing there. So instead of passing by, show him that you care.
Music is a healing political act.
Why me and why you?
I had a very bad case of pneumonia. It looked like I was gonna die. And my lover at the time, Richard, said it would be really a shame if you died without leaving some of these songs as a musical legacy that you do. So we set about recording.
And love
Michael Callan was a musician when he fell sick with symptoms of the AIDS virus. He was suddenly faced with the widespread assumption that all he could do was wait for death.
There was a growing frustration among people with AIDS that there just weren't any therapies that seemed to be working. The system that had been set up by the federal government to test AIDS therapies was a complete disaster.
When you have a time of great frustration and a time of suffering and pain, until you have the total solution, there will be criticisms and there will be frustrations. At the time that there were concerns that there wasn't enough drugs out there, we were testing every drug that was imaginable. If a drug doesn't work, you don't want to make it get out there.
Dr. Anthony Fauci was the link between the researchers and the sick. Government laboratories were urgently sifting through dozens of drugs for something effective against the virus. Part of his job was to decide when to try them out on patients.
If it's cellular DNA, fine, and if it's viral, great, we'll PCR it.
His dilemma was obvious. Outside the labs, people were dying. Inside, researchers were still working in a fog of ignorance about the disease. And even if they did find a drug which looked promising, it had to be tested for safety first. After years of success, the great American medicine machine found itself up against a problem it couldn't crack.
It was a feeling of racing against the suffering and death of a lot of people. And there was a great concern that we get something and we get it quickly.
But quick to the medical authorities wasn't quick enough for the patients. Among those who suggested a new approach was Michael Callan.
People with their backs against the wall, people like me, people with AIDS, facing the very real possibility of our death, will do whatever we have to do to stay alive.
People with AIDS who were self-empowered said, well, wait a minute. We are a tremendously diverse community. We have doctors, we have the patients, we have a certain expertise. Why don't we do our own treatment research, and if we find a drug that we think's promising, whether the government thinks it's promising or not, let's smuggle it into the country.
In San Francisco, the idea of smuggling drugs was taken up by a highly paid management consultant.
Suddenly, literally through my friend Mark, who lives with me here, he became ill. And we began to see very quickly people all around us getting ill. It just went from nothing into an avalanche in a matter of a few months. There were newspaper accounts I read that there were 2 or 3 drugs that looked promising in laboratory studies against it. And the government was saying, well, that's fine, and maybe 3 or 4 years from now, you'll be able to use these drugs.
Some guy in Palm Beach.
Martin Delaney was then a consultant to Bay Area banks and corporations. Frustrated by the delay, he started analyzing all the information that was circulating about unapproved drugs, and then working out where to obtain them and how to bring them in.
Fund town meetings and materials.
It made no sense to someone who was sick and maybe had 6 months or 12 months to live to say, I'm going to wait for the government to finish those studies. What also became apparent to us was that some of those drugs were already on the market in other places in the world. So I just literally got in the car and drove to Mexico. And didn't know exactly where I was going. But I knew what a pharmacia was. And I knew the drugs, and I had heard from other people that they were available over the counter. At that time, it was ribavirin and isoprinosine. They were 2 of the 3 or 4 drugs that the government had said they were going to be studying. And it was sort of a natural, I hear you're going down, you know, can you get some for me? Can you pick up some for me? And that's really how it expanded. Initially, it was just through a private little networking. And suddenly, from going down for 3 or 4 people, there were 10 people, then there were 20, then there were 30. And it, you know, it really quickly was coming into something that I couldn't really do on my own.
Project Inform, may I help you?
After a few months, Delaney's freelance drug smuggling turned into an organization called Project Inform. The idea was not simply to obtain supplies, but to hand out information and counseling to the people who needed treatment.
Cures and remedies that, we just don't like.
Buyers' clubs sprang up around the country, with the authorities in the end turning a blind eye to what was happening.
Life in the 80s, AIDS, what the well-stocked kitchen will have. I have some
in New York, Michael Callan's group even launched home video tips on how to make your own drug treatments in the kitchen.
There's my little apron so that I don't get my clothes dirty, because egg lecithin is very messy.
I knew that it was a race for time. I had no options. I had no choices. What I did and didn't do, his life depended on it. I didn't know the first thing about AIDS. That's where I really have to say I will forever be indebted to the gay community, because they really helped me out. They more or less, step by step, told me what to do. I had him on underground medicines. He was on AL-721. We would be in the hospitals with him while he was inpatient, and my husband would make sure that the hallways were clear, and then there I would beat up the egg lecithin with my blender in the hospital room and give it to him and not tell any of the doctors what we were doing.
Do-it-yourself medicine lived off rumor and hope, and both were about to get an extraordinary boost. In the Beth Israel Hospital in New York, doctors were finding that one particular drug was having remarkable results. When the news first started circulating, Dr. Donna Mildven was asked to try it on her patients. The drug was called AZT, and it became the focus of a movement that turned people with AIDS from scattered victims into a political force.
Our patients were desperate for treatment, but yet they understood, because all anybody ever heard was, this is a fatal disease. There were several patients, those who had come in, I think, more severely wasted and at a more advanced stage of their illness. And these patients began to gain weight. A couple of them went back to work, got color back in their face. I can't even describe the sense of joy and accomplishment that we experienced. This was the beginning. We really believed that this was the handle that we've been waiting for after having buried so many 30-year-olds.
Before a new drug could be put on the market, it usually had to go through meticulous government tests. Memories of the thalidomide disaster lived on, and some drugs took as long as 10 years to get through. But everyone needed AZT, the patients, the drug company concerned, and the government.
For the first time today, the government approved prescription sales of a drug to treat AIDS. The drug AZT is not a cure for the disease, but it has prolonged the lives of some AIDS victims.
The drug was approved in record time. Despite signs of some side effects, it was approved for sale by March '87 at a price.
We were all blown away by the price. I mean, when it first came out, it was between $8,000 to $10,000 a year. This was just mind-boggling, and especially in light of the fact that the government had put a lot of the work into the early development of that drug.
We charge a price that we think is appropriate in order for us to get a return to support our R&D effort.
You know, the company was claiming it spent $80 million developing it. It was like, how could they possibly have? They did one stinking little study. You know, one little study of about 230 or 250 people. I forget what the numbers were. So we became very distrustful of that.
The drug company, Burroughs Wellcome, was seen as the villain, though the project director, Dr. Danny King, felt there was nothing to apologize for.
In the early going, there was not a, quote, market. And if you're running a business, you have to try to get your investment back in some way. And had the decision been made entirely based on market potential, AZT would never have been investigated. The market researchers said, hey, you know, you only got like 5,000, 10,000 people infected. They'll never be able to pay for this drug.
The number of potential customers was now rising fast.
We're going to Edmay today. Yes.
But there were still few who could afford the price. In New York, the playwright and activist Larry Kramer sounded a call to arms. ACT UP was born, the AIDS coalition to unleash power.
First of all, you have to realize by the time AZT was approved, thousands of people had already taken it. And part of the anger is that we were handed this drug as a cure to shut us up. These kids all turned out in droves, and ACT UP was the place to be around this country. It brought all the young kids out responding to this call for arms. And although I take credit for having sounded the alarm and making the speech, and I call myself the founder, those things don't get founded unless there's an energy that exists in the community that's ready for it. So it touched a nerve and at the right time.
Act up, fight back, fight AIDS.
2 weeks later, ACT UP took their message onto the streets.
Fight back, fight AIDS.
What's happening now is that patients are desperate. They will take anything. They'll pop anything into their mouth now. This is the first case, I think, in history where the actual afflicted people are taking control, taking charge of the epidemic.
Release those drugs! Release those drugs! Release those drugs!
And this is a rally demanding that Boroughs Welcome lower the price of AZT.
The time after the approval of AZT, when the protesters, sort of conversion of Wall Street, were demanding that people sell the stock, was a very difficult time for the people internally at Wellcome who had, for the previous 2 years, worked 80 and 100-hour weeks to see that this thing happened the way it happened, felt it was a tremendous success. Only to find that, people were in the streets wanting to, tear the buildings down. It was a very, very bittersweet kind of a situation.
The conflict gave birth to a new breed of activist. Peter Staley was one of the most determined.
I was diagnosed with AIDS-related complex while I was working as a bond trader on Wall Street. I started to look around in desperation for ways that I could find treatments to help save my life. And there was nothing coming out of our government's efforts, I quickly realized. So I began to get angrier and angrier. And the first meeting I went to at ACT UP was really a wild experience for me, coming from Wall Street. Lesbians, gay men, old, young, but there was such a level of anger and immediacy and this desire to get something done and to get it done fast. And so I was this bond trader by day and this AIDS activist by night, and eventually it just got too much to juggle, and I was going nuts.
He was also getting sicker. His declining T4 cell count meant his immune system was deteriorating.
The stock market crash of October '87, my T4s fell right with the Dow, it seemed, and so I said, enough of this job is going to kill me. So I went on disability and decided to become a full-time AIDS activist.
So far, the activists were not having much effect. Retrovir, the trade name for AZT, remained expensive, and even though there were signs that its benefits were limited, the publicity stoked demand and boosted profits. In the spring of 1989, Staley organized a well-publicized invasion of the company's headquarters in North Carolina. It led to little more than his own arrest.
You guys have any comments?
Boroughs Welcome is profiting off of our lives. That's what we did today, what we did. And if they don't see to start listening to my community, to our community, the AIDS community, then we're going to be back.
Boroughs Welcome's profits doubled in 3 years, helped in part by the confidence government scientists still showed in AZT's performance.
In the summer of '89, the government released some studies showing that AZT was not only effective for people with full-blown AIDS, but was also very possibly effective for people like myself with AIDS-related complex. They were going to make a lot more money on the drug, and we said, enough's enough, this price has got to come down. So we moved into action again.
This time, they infiltrated the New York Stock Exchange itself, dressed in business suits to look like traders.
We went in at the opening bell, walked around the trading floor for a while very nervously with pen and paper in hand, ready to do a trade. But we discovered a small VIP balcony, it was called, and it looked out over the trading floor. We had these miniature marine foghorns that after we unfurled the banner, we raised up and set off, which drowned out the opening bell and brought trading to a virtual halt. It never really got started.
The company which makes AZT, the only drug approved by the government for the treatment of people with AIDS, announced today it is cutting the wholesale price of the drug by 20%. The
activists were arrested, but triumphant.
Who use AZT.
And a judge threw out the charges against us and called us heroes. So it was the action that I'm most proud of.
It was a hollow victory. It soon became clear that the drug had limited benefits. After 2 years or so, the improvements wore off.
AZT became a source of great disappointment when our first patients who had done so well, after that finite period of time, began to go back and lose all that ground that they had gained. And it was sort of, always reminds me of, you know, the ups and downs of clinical research.
AZT didn't work, and it had minimal effect on a maximum number of people, and it had some effect on a minimum number of people. It was simply a drug that was not going to save our lives, which is what we had been hoping it would do.
But it had been a struggle as much about power as about pills, and in that there were long-term benefits for people with AIDS.
It was about empowerment and taking action. What we argued for and preached for, in a sense, both with the government and the patients and doctors, was to take charge of your own life. You know, that you didn't have to lay back and be a passive victim to this disease, that there were things you could do.
In the autumn of 1987, a great quilt was unfurled in Washington, a memorial to the tens of thousands of people who had died of AIDS.
Reggie Hightower, Gary Johnson, Neil Yeager.
The quilt was the brainchild of a Californian activist called Cleve Jones.
When we unfolded it in Washington, D.C., and I know what went into that. The amount of work, the tens of thousands of people who took up needle and thread, the hundreds of thousands of people who have shared the memories of their lost sons and daughters and lovers and brothers and sisters and moms and dads.
As the death toll rose, more and more people, far beyond the gay communities where AIDS first struck, were becoming involved.
Gary Barnhill. Simon Guzman. Lawrence. David Calgaro. And my friend, Marvin Feldman.
The quilt seemed the symbol of their dissatisfaction with the government's response.
And all of this has been inadequate. In all that we have done, with all the red ribbons and all the candlelight marches and the quilts and the lobbying and the protests and the arrests and civil disobedience and the testimony, and all of it has been insufficient to move the leaders of our country to responsible action. And so I'm proud of the quilt. It's a beautiful thing, and it's a monstrosity.
But the movement was broadening with the inexorable spread of the disease. Among the ethnic minorities of the inner cities, more and more people were falling sick. Many were heterosexuals. In New York, this came as no surprise to Dr. Iris Davis, whose patients came from the poorer sections of the city.
There's always been a heterosexual epidemic in this country. You know, if a woman had any history of intravenous drug use, they listed intravenous drug use as her reason for having HIV. But more women who use intravenous drugs have a partner, a male partner, who uses intravenous drugs. So no one can tell me whether they got it from their sexual contact with their partner or whether they got it through their own shooting up use of drugs. So what was happened was they continuously missed the epidemic.
Officially, the level of risk to women from straight sex was unclear. But Davis believed that was largely because most research only looked at the effect of HIV on male homosexuals.
AIDS in women is absolutely undercounted because AIDS is a man-made definition. Almost half the clinical research studies were devoted to Kaposi sarcoma. Well, that's not going to include women. That's almost exclusively seen in gay men. But if you're coming in and you're a woman with a little vaginal candidiasis, which women have had from time immemorial, and then no, a doctor's not necessarily going to say, boom, let me think about HIV.
Dr. Davis helped set up a special AIDS clinic in Brooklyn. The first results from people who came to be tested were a shock.
Like 1 out of every 5 women we were testing was positive. We were devastated. The majority of women infected with HIV disease in this country are disproportionately Afro-American and Puerto Rican derivative. So now these are the poorest women from these communities who are infected, okay? They don't have health care access to begin with. Nobody cares if they die.
By 1989, 10,000 American women were known to be infected with HIV. There was little research into how it affected them, and they were largely excluded from the experimental drug programs on which so many pinned their hopes.
If women cannot get health care, if women cannot get experimental drugs, if women cannot get what they need, they're going to continue to die at a rate that is much faster, 3 times faster than white men are dying from this disease.
Women were absolutely justified in their concern that, in fact, women-specific issues were not being addressed. The women who were infected were in a relatively disenfranchised group. Many of them were minorities, and minorities were in inner cities, and the healthcare delivery system was a major stumbling block in getting clinical trials to that group.
The reality is that you have a burgeoning epidemic. You haven't stopped it on the preventive end, you're not diagnosing it quickly enough, you're not treating it because those women have no access to health care. Does that make it sound like a balloon that's going to blow up in your face? I hope so.
The National Institutes of Health outside Washington were coming in for more and more criticism. Millions of dollars were being spent on research, but viewed from outside, the scientists seemed more concerned with magic cures than with preventative medicines that would prolong life.
It became dismally clear to us that the government really wasn't studying many of the diseases that people with AIDS were dying from. They were not looking at different possibilities of attacking the virus. They were only looking at Me Too drugs, very similar to AZT. And it was a very, very conservative approach to doing research that was never going to, as far as we could tell, elicit truly effective therapies to stop this virus and the illnesses that kill people with AIDS.
By contrast, a few community doctors like Joseph Sonnabend were doing much better. Instead of pursuing the single great cure, he was simply concentrating on warding off the infections from which his patients actually died.
My doctor, Joe Sonnabend, just didn't understand how doctors could let their patients die when there were cheap, easily available treatments that had a theoretical likelihood of keeping people alive until we found the magic bullet. People that take prophylactic medications have a dramatically improved survival profile. I'm living proof. I am about to celebrate the 11th anniversary of my official diagnosis with AIDS, and I have absolutely beaten all statistical odds.
If I've had any success with Michael Callan, as he attributes his survival to my treatments, I think maybe it's more to do with the fact that I have a healthy skepticism of traditional or current medical approaches.
Sonnabend was not popular. HIV research took the lion's share of government funds, and his approach seemed to question whether it was all well spent.
The larger community responded with great and totally irrational hostility, which totally surprised me. I had really, nothing had prepared me for that. The extent of the hostility was very, very great, and it was, I was demonized in some kind of fashion.
They all said, show me the study, show me the AMA guideline that says I should be prescribing this, and then I will. But I'm not taking any risk until the organized medical establishment tells me that this is how I should manage your case of it. So many doctors got so frustrated seeing their patients die of pneumocystis that finally Joe stopped seeming quite so crazy, plus the patients in his practice weren't dying at the same rate as these other doctors, and gradually, begrudgingly, without giving him any credit, people started trying Dapsone and Bactrim, and it worked.
The activists' next target was the NIH itself, the consequence of failing to meet expectations.
This is a story of a coalition. My interpretation, my rendition of ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power, the NIH on its final hour. Can you say it with me? Storm the NIH. Let's go. Storm the NIH. This is war. For the sick. For the poor.
People with AIDS now demanded to be involved in the decisions about research priorities being taken inside the NIH.
Basically, what we're doing is blasting the horns every 12 minutes to remind people that statistically right now, every 12 minutes, someone in America is dying from AIDS. When we were here last year, it was every 25 minutes. And now it's every 12 minutes. And when we come back next year, and unfortunately we'll probably have to, it'll be about every 5 or 6 minutes.
$1 billion, one AIDS drug. 10 years later, these greedy thugs say we're doing the best we can. Bullshit. 100,000 deaths they invest, you're full of it.
But to take a disease and say, we spent $1 billion and we only have one drug and there's no cure, I think you have to put that into some historical perspective and look at other diseases that killed millions and millions and millions of people. You could say the same thing for cancer. You could say $20, $30 billion and still no cure for cancer. So if the cancer community was as organized as the HIV-infected community, you'd see an awful lot of demonstrations because you could say the same thing. But these things take time, the same way that research on HIV takes time.
I hate the people who say, oh, science takes its own time, we can't discover it until and so and so and so and so. We know what the questions are, we know how to research them, we know who the doctors, the best doctors and scientists are to research them. It just hasn't been done.
The turnout reflected how far the political bandwagon had rolled.
as a person of color, as an AIDS activist, as someone who works in this field, I'm here because I believe that people of color should have the right to choose to be enrolled in clinical trials, and they should not be excluded from clinical trials just because they're poor.
In all the noise, the truth was that both sides needed each other. The patients needed the scientists needed the political pressure.
I got up on this roof, I began to hang a banner, and the police got up there rather quickly and wrestled with me, thinking I was going to, resist or something. Of course I wasn't. But walking towards me was Tony Fauci. I was sitting there with a very large police officer dragging me with my hands behind my back, and Fauci goes, "Peter?" I go, "Tony." He said, "You all right?" I said, "Yes, Tony, just doing my job. Guess you're just doing yours."
Peter Staley was the first one to get arrested at the NIH, and I passed him as he was being dragged away by the police, and he said, "I made it, Tony. I was the first one to get arrested." But I've learned to really understand the activist mode and the activist mentality. So for an activist, they were doing just the right thing. They were bringing a lot of national attention to the problem.
It made all three networks, and generally is credited with at least opening up the closed doors of the NIH to people with HIV. We're now sitting on all of their committees that decide which trials are done and how the protocols are written.
The following year, Peter Staley was invited to the World Conference on AIDS to share the platform with the very people he'd been fighting. It was recognition of how much the politics of AIDS had changed and how little the science had achieved.
AIDS is a test of who we are as a people. When future generations ask what we did in the war, we have to be able to tell them that we were out here fighting. Remember that someday the AIDS crisis will be over. And when that day has come and gone, there will be a people alive on this earth, gay people and straight people, black people and white people, men and women, who will hear the story that once there was a terrible disease and that a brave group of people stood up and fought, and in some cases died, so that others might live and be free.
From the earliest days of the epidemic, the United States possessed the knowledge and the resources to halt the spread of the epidemic. We had the money, we had the scientists and researchers. We had everything we needed in place to meet this challenge, and we failed because we lacked the will. Our struggle against AIDS was aborted by bigotry, by stupidity, and by greed. And the consequence of that failure, this perception of it as a gay American problem, has been that millions of people worldwide are doomed, and the vast majority of them, of course, are neither gay nor American.
Ronald J. Milheiser, Neil J. Robertson, John White,
Frank Alvarez, Sean Buchanan,